right? Chances are that his hopes would have been completely dashed if he had a white wife. In fact, we can look to one particular example as some evidence. We can look to the example of Harold Ford, who at the time that he was running for the US Senate in Tennessee was not married at all. But there was an ad that the Republican National Committee ran against him where they had a woman whom he allegedly met, or an actor playing a woman who he allegedly met at the Playboy Mansion, who then said, call me. And the Republican National Committee came across a lot of criticism for running this ad because, as one journalist explained, the ad smacked of racism, clearly, implying that Ford was somehow unfit for office because he was a womanizer who liked white girls, right? And so when we look at Harold Ford's situation, it's difficult to imagine that on a national scale, Obama would have fared any different than Harold Ford did in Tennessee. But the prejudice against interraciality through coupled jobs does not just stop with white resistance. Black voters, too, would have been unlikely to grant Obama 96% of their vote had Michelle been white instead of black. So in his book, and a member of the club, Reflections on Life in a Racially Polarized World, author Lawrence Otis Graham identified in-race marriage as the most central element in diagnosing racial loyalty among blacks. And Professor Kennedy has done that as well in his own work. He asserted that blacks, quote, look for what we consider the final determinant of a person's black identity, that thing that will allow us to bestow our unqualified appreciation. We look for the litmus test of loyalty to the race, the photo of the person's significant other or spouse. And it's against this backdrop that we can see how a white Michelle Obama would have dampened Obama's chances even within the black community. Here again, we can look to Harold Ford's experiences to get some evidence. So Harold Ford, after his Senate loss in Tennessee, he gets married, he marries a white woman, and he decides he's going to move to New York. And he decides he's going to move to New York, in fact, because he's worried about racism, a lot of the racism around Obama's campaign at that time, and he decides this is just not a good place for me to have a multiracial family. And although Ford at the time was working in New York at a 7-figure job at Merrill Lynch, he begins to think about running for the now empty seat of Hillary Clinton. And the public reaction from blacks suggested that he'd engage in political suicide by marrying a white woman. So for instance, Pat, a black citizen from his former home state, asserted, quote, I think he has not given his political career any thought. If he runs for any office again, surely he won't win. You don't carry the black vote and marry white. Such prejudice against interraciality on the market, however, extends beyond politics. It goes beyond just the jobs of being president, senator, and congressman. Various jobs exist in which a spouse, in most cases a wife, is viewed as a key asset to job performance. And in these jobs, having a different race spouse or partner can be damaging. So let's look at the actual case of a white man named Craig Holcomb, who asserted that he lost his job as an assistant coach for a basketball team at Iona College because he had married a black woman. So among the prejudices that he experienced were a reaction from one vice president at the college after he sent out his wedding invitation. So he sends out his wedding invitation to one vice president of the college, and he gets a quote from this vice president who says, "You're really gonna marry that Aunt Jemima? You really are an N-word lover." And then second, according to Holcomb, the director of athletics at that time then tells his wife, and now the head coach's girlfriend, who has been set up with the head coach by his wife, the head coach's girlfriend is a black woman and the head coach is a white man, that she tells both of them, well, you can no longer come to alumni Gold Club events. Gold Club events are events that were designed to raise money for the athletics program. And they say this even though in the past other partners had been allowed to come, and for a brief period of time both women had been allowed to come before. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the district court decision to grant the college's motion for summary judgment, and in 2008 held for the first time that there can be a Title VII violation where an employer takes an action against an employee because of the employee's association with a person of another race. And Judge Guido Calabresi authored that opinion, and he actually was really great on offering the many reasons why summary judgment should have been denied. So for example, he decides he's going to highlight what we would call the tipping effects, the tipping points at which he says, this is really just not a case about completely excluding all blacks. This is not about pure discrimination, pure exclusion. This is a case about the tipping point. It's about limiting the black presence at these alumni Gold Club events. And it's about doing so for primarily white alumni that may be turned off by too many black bodies. He also said that, well, this is also may not be about pure and simple traditional racial discrimination, that there could be a more complicated form of prejudice and bias at play. In particular, he highlighted that the decision makers may not be motivated by racism per se, but instead solely by disapproval of interracial relationships. Still, because of our narrow official definitions of job duties and performance, and anti-discrimination law's very narrow understandings of these jobs and the ways in which they unknowingly involve race, what Calabresi's opinion could not do was recognize the harms that stem from prejudice against workers and interracial couples where job functions extend beyond the official description and into the family. So lots of scholars have actually talked about the notion of the ideal worker in the workplace. But what this scholarship does not talk about is that the characteristics of the ideal worker are not just limited to the fact that he's male, that he's heterosexual, and that he's white, and that he's also coupled with a wife who allows him to perform his duties without interruption, but that he's coupled with a wife who is of the same race as he is. And what this means is that the courts never unpack or analyze the full harms that come from the invisible norms about not only who should be at work, but also about who should be behind the scenes supporting these people at work. Again, consider the full range of occupations where partners of an employee, if they exist at all, are expected to be part of the public face at events. Many of these jobs revolve around fundraising, college presidencies, being college sports coaches. And it's easy when we imagine these situations and when we think of plaintiffs like those I discuss in my book to see how an unwritten couple requirement at work, a requirement that essentially demands heterosexuality and monoraciality within couples, provides an incentive or at least an additional reason for individuals to decide against being part of an interracial couple. It's in this way that what seems to be worlds apart in employment law has a direct impact on family and the assumptions that we make about families and the disadvantages that flow and will continue to flow from those assumptions until they are routinely challenged and unpacked. So one important fact, Craig Holcomb was single when he was hired by Iona College. And one question is, had he known about the lifelong repercussions that would come to being married to a black woman, would he make the same decision again? In fact, there are a number of qualitative studies that show that people in interracial couples are really strategic about when they even introduce their partners to their colleagues at work and their supervisors, and in some cases, whether they even bother to introduce them at all. Moreover, if Holcomb would still decide to marry his wife in the face of such repercussions, would Iona College have hired him to begin with had he applied to the job with a black wife? And the question really is, how often does this question not even get asked or even get explored because of invisible norms that remain unspoken and invisible? We need to think of ways in which anti-discrimination law can bring these issues to light. Right now, current anti-discrimination law's inability to address such harms against interraciality works not only to allow for the continuation of such discrimination in the workplace, but also works to reinforce the framing of the ideal family as monoracial. And that, I believe, is not according to our hearts. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you. I'm a law student from China.
Oh.
I'm doing a 1-year LLM program here. And I just want to thank you for your presentation. I want to ask your view on the relationship between racism and discrimination against interracial relationships or institutions. It seems to me that racism is the reason, because it just seems right for a white person to be with a white person, and for a black person to be with a black person. And the reason people think it's not right for them to mix is just really intrinsically related to the fact that they think that you know, the well, I don't want to call it black race, but the black person, like black people in general, are inferior, and like, even though, for example, the black male is married to a white woman, they would be thinking that he's not who he is if he is married to a white woman. Like, he needs the ratcheting up of his wife to get there, or something like that, because of his assumed inferiority, not because of the simple fact that this is an interracial marriage.
I think I understand. So you're saying that you can tell me whether I'm understanding you correctly. So you're asking about whether it's really just basic racism that's underlying all of this discrimination against interracial couples, a general perception. So I'd never heard this term before. I actually started working on this book that blackbirds should be with blackbirds and doves should be with doves. Anyone ever heard that? It's apparently a popular saying. And I think that's some of it. That's clearly part of it. Part of the reason why people have grown up believing, to the extent that we view race as real, or the people see race as real, is that they think that people who are part of the same racial group simply belong with each other. And I think you're right in saying that that's linked to inferiority, to perceptions of inferiority, right? So if you look at the differences in intermarriage rates between various groups and whites, you could even say that kind of tracks particular status within our society. So again, Professor Kennedy has written about this as well, that if you look at, for example, intermarriage rates involving whites and Asian Americans, or whites and Latinos, and whites and blacks are the least likely of any racial minority group to outmarry. And that's in part because surveys show that blacks are viewed as the least desirable partners. Whites in general are the least likely to outmarry, and I think that's in part because of this sense that one is superior. It's really interesting if you look at data, whether not consciously held by all people, but unconsciously held, right? And even with my students who would consider themselves to be progressive, they kind of view that as natural, right? That sort of that race matching is natural, and I think that linked to that is certainly some unconscious racism. I think that the way that the racism plays out is different. It's a little bit more complicated in a sense because the way that it plays out with different groups, the reaction, the resistance into racial relationships may have different reasons for it. So if you look at some of Erica Cheeto Childs' work, she talks about sort of like white resistance to interracial couples is mainly rooted in, for example, a sense of superiority, or a sense that, like, again, blackbirds belong with blackbirds and doves belong with doves, that it's just viewed as something that kind of naturally happens in the world. With blacks, for example, though, there may be other things going on. So it may not be resistance to the idea of simply marrying someone of a different race, but it may be kind of, and this is a different kind of racism, protection, like we're worried about how society is going to treat you, or we're worried that you've internalized racism and you don't like yourself, and that's why you've outmarried. And so what she found with her surveys is that really when you look at, so for example, you look at more minority groups, you'll see that as sort of being more the basis for resisting interracial relationships than a general view of superiority, or a general view of this is how nature should be. It's a more protective, yeah. And we actually see this in the Rhinelander case. So for example, Alice's father is said to have said to, apparently he said to Leonard, well, I don't think you guys should marry. I don't want you to marry. And it's not clear whether he was saying that. He said the two worlds that you come from, you can't simply bridge that divide. And who knows if that's because of class or that's because of racism. But here he was. It wasn't that he disliked Leonard. It was that he felt like their two worlds were too much for them to divide. And I think part of it, he thought, only harm will come out of it. That once it's impossible to keep this a secret, and only harm will come out of it. And in many ways, he was right in terms of the prediction for his own daughter, that she, that she certainly, if you look at the trial, she suffered the worst part of it. He unfortunately didn't have the courage to stand up to his family, and so he also dies of a broken heart, if we want to say that. But she is forced to humiliate herself basically, and she lives a life in which some people would say was very lonely.
Thank you. So Beatrice Hinton, I'm a 1L at the law school. I'm wondering with the rise in multiracial families, how sort of racial ambiguity fits into this coupling rule. You have the picture of the president and first lady, and in a lot of the conversations in the media stuff that I've seen about it, it hasn't just been a discussion like, oh, you know, he has a black wife, but it's like she's a real black woman.
Yes,
you
yes,
know?
yes.
Her hair and this and that, right? As opposed to other things. And with like colorism playing a part in black communities, I'm just wondering if these studies or other cases have come in today's world with a lot of folks who are mixed, who may identify as black but don't look black on the outside to other people necessarily because of their assumptions about what a black person looks like. You know, how does that person sort of fit in? So if, you know, Mrs. Obama was black, but she didn't necessarily look that way, you know, how would that person be received by both the white community and the black community?
Right. Yeah. So great question. So I mean, I think part of what interesting question. I mean, and one of the things I would say, I would actually say if I were to pose this question and say Michelle Obama was not a brown-skinned woman from the south side of Chicago with like, I don't know, what do you call them, like authentic, way people would think about it, authentic sort of black credentials, would Obama would have won, would he have won with a light-skinned wife who grew up in Back Bay, right? And I think that in some ways you could say that may have raised issues about his credibility with the black community. Is he really down? Michelle gives him certainly a lot of credibility in that regard, and he was already suspect because he was biracial himself, and also because he was of second-generation American, right? And so you saw even articles about him. There was an interesting article that Deborah Dickerson wrote about Obama. It would be great if that he could be the first black president if he were actually black. So there were all these pieces questioning whether even Obama himself was a black man, even though that's how he identified. And you saw certain moments in which he performed that identity in order to assure people that he was part of the community. The differences between, I live in Iowa, so all the politicians come through Iowa, so you could see them at different points, and so the different presentation that he makes to a black church versus a wider audience, that certainly came through, and I think part of that was shoring up his credibility, certainly with the black community. I think that I think that story is changing in terms of where people who are multiracial fit. And I think the story now is that a lot of people find that disruptive, right? So a lot of people want to know, a lot of multiracial people talk about going through these mini racial trials. What are you? And people want to know, what are you, or how do you identify, or people are being forced to choose. And I think even though and if you look at these cases too, people are, Nancy Leong actually wrote an article where she sort of talks about multiracial individuals when they bring claims based on their multiracial status, and the court essentially puts them in one box, right? And so right now we have boxes that are really, we assume that race is clear cut, that you're either part of one group or you're part of another group. Ultimately, I think it's good because I think it destabilizes this notion of race as being real. It exposes the way in which race is a social construct. And I think that if you look at the data in sociology, people who are multiracial, now one exception, people who are multiracial are more likely, we know of course now from the census and the movement to change the census, are more likely to identify as multiracial. And in fact, if you look at children of Asian American and white couples, or Latino and white couples, those people were more likely to identify as multiracial. Or as white. And so some people could say that it's actually having sort of a negative impact because people are more likely to identify as white, and is that sort of a way of reinforcing whiteness? The one exception, of course, is with blacks, for whom the one-drop rule has been particularly strong. And so even though children who are multiracial of African descent are more likely than they were before to identify as multiracial, they're still more likely than other multiracial children to identify as black, or to feel like they have to pick one category. That can depend on a lot of different factors. Often depends on, it can depend on who your parent is, who's part of the minority race. It can depend on what you look like. There's a huge correlation between what you look like and how you identify. So some people would argue that actually, it destabilizes categories to some extent, but it's also reinforcing them because to the extent that people can choose to be white, some people are choosing to do that.
I'm a PhD candidate in the African American Studies department. I was just wondering if you could talk about how the black community responded to the Rhinelander case.
Oh, yeah. So looking at the black press, the Chicago Defender covered this, and other newspapers did. And the black press was really generally very supportive of Alice Rhinelander. So really willing to call out what it was, that there was a reaction to her because she was, because there was some kind of racism behind this sort of forced annulment trial. And so there was no negative, I didn't read anywhere any kind of negative description of Alice at all. People were willing to call out racism. And then the other thing is, you would see in the black press some stories like maybe they're going to run away to Europe, that there was even some kind of like more open support of their love relationship, that maybe that there's a way for them to get out of this. You see it appear in certain literature. I'm trying to think about what W.E.B. Du Bois, he made a reference to the case. And I can't recall exactly what he said, but it was really sort of just calling out the racism and the challenge of Alice. There was one African-American man I remember quoted, and I don't remember if he was quoted in a black newspaper or not, who made a point about Alice wanting to be white. He was someone who claimed that he had dated her, he went on a date, and she told him she wanted nothing to do with him because she was essentially white. And that was the only negative thing that I recall reading about it. But from what I read in the black press, it was mainly, in a way, talking about the case as sort of another piece of evidence about racism.
Hi, my name is Donald Block. I'm an alumnus, back for our 50th reunion.
Oh.
So I wonder, have you ever thought about the topic in relation to religion? I can remember when people married out of their religion, they got the same kind of reception as marrying out of their race. Have you ever thought about that?
Well, no, I haven't thought about it seriously, but a lot of people ask me that question. And I think that certainly some of it still applies, right? So, for example, what I talked about, the different reactions and the different kinds of resistance to interreligious marriages or interreligious relationships, that I think that for people who are in the dominant group, sort of Protestant Christians, that if there is resistance to marrying outside of one's religion, it tends to be because of, well, that's, a strange religion, or not necessarily, or maybe inferior religion, and that for groups that are smaller, that have a smaller population belonging to that religion, that those groups, their resistance tends to be more out of other kinds of concerns. It may be out of self-preservation of the group, or it may be out of concerns about the children, which has its own kind of racism or religious discrimination to it as well. But there's some similarities, but I haven't thought deeply about it. I think that some of the issues that I talk about in the book, for example, with employment discrimination, or with housing discrimination, may not apply completely, in part because of what people would see as the sort of the visual aspect of race, so that you can't, when you're looking at someone, necessarily tell that they're a interreligious couple, but you may be able to tell that with an interracial couple. And in particular with some of the microaggressions that some of the couples talk about. So going out and not being perceived as a couple, that's less likely to happen if the one difference is you're of the same race, but if you're different religions, than if you're of different races and people can, in their minds, visibly see that you're of different races. That makes sense.
Since the microphone is here, I'm also an alumnus, also here for my 50th. First of all, I just want to say that when Obama ran for Congress in a black district in Chicago, the incumbent congressman, who's still in Congress, used the issue of a white wife as well as being not an African American
Yes, yes.
against him. That just exemplifies what you were talking about. The whole discussion thus far, examples anyway, have been white men and black women. Would the situation be any different if it were reversed?
Yeah, so I mean, it's one of the things I have in the book I talk about a hypothetical which would involve a Condoleezza Rice running for president with a white husband. And I think that there may be a different reaction to it. I think that in the book I talk about sort of why historically there's been sort of a strong resistance against sort of black female, white female couples, and you see strong comments made against against black male, white female couples. You also see it with black female, white male couples, but sometimes you see it stronger with black male, white female couples. Oh, sorry, what was your ultimate question? I'm sorry.
Oh, whether if it were
Oh, okay, sorry. Yes, yeah. So I talk about a hypothetical in which Condoleezza Rice, and I actually say that it would be different. I'll tell you why I think it would be different. I can tell you some of the evidence that I have for that. So I think that for Condoleezza Rice, there are a whole variety of factors. There, my imaginary Condoleezza Rice is one. I think that unlike for Obama, it would be better for Obama to be single than it would be for him to be married to a white woman, I think, right? But I think for a woman, it would be better for her to be married than to not be married, than to be married to, it would be worse for her to be unmarried than to be married to a white man. I also think that for Condoleezza Rice, one of the things that I found with a lot of couples, only with black female, white male couples, not with black male, white female couples, is a lot of people would say, well, when people meet me, when they find out that I have a white partner, it kind of signals to people that I'm palatable. People begin to sort of, like, they're not worried about me anymore in a way. White people are calmer around me, they're friendlier around me, that it signals something about that I'm not a black person who doesn't like white people or is going to have preconceived notions about white people. This was only with black women and white men, or with gay couples, right? And so, for whatever reason, for a black woman who's married to a white man, that sends off a different signal than it does if a black man is married to a white woman.
It's really gender related.
It's gender related. I also,
Well, I was wondering what your response is to the sort of de Blasio case.
Oh, yes.
And the fact that
yes.
His multiracial
Yes.
family was seen as like a huge benefit
Yes.
for him in terms of the race, and that was a black woman and a white man. But
Yes.
was that? I mean, how would you explain that? The fact that he was, he really prominently featured his family,
Right.
including his son, who was obviously the big
Yes.
star there. But
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. So I think that's a positive turn, but I also think that only in New York, right? Only in New York and possibly California. So if you sort of look at statistics on interracial couples, and you were to say, so like the West Coast has the most interracial couples, and then you go to the East Coast, and then like the South and the Midwest, are really much lower. And a lot of that is New York and California, I feel like, at the East and the West Coast. And so I think that there's something about those populations that allows that interracial couples do not stand out as much. as they would in other areas. But I also think that it works in New York in part because you've got a diverse voting population. And also you had an issue that was really prominent about racial profiling that mattered to a lot of voters. And so then the fact that he was concerned about those issues signaled to voters, to minority voters, that not only was he concerned about this as a political matter, but as a personal matter. And so it sort of added strength to the credibility, to his sort of his concerns and his stated concerns about wanting to do something about it if he was elected into office. And so we'll see if he actually wins. I know he's essentially going to win, right? And I think, but I think that works in New York City. It'd be interesting to see if it would work on a larger stage, and I think it worked in New York City for all those reasons. That I think it's just not as hard to be part of a multiracial family in New York City, and then also you've got sort of the like very raced issues that in a way gave him credibility in the same way that Michelle Obama gave Barack Obama credibility when he ran for president in 2008.
When I saw the title of your talk, and I've spent most of my life in this area, and my children are in the Bay Area, so we perhaps haven't experienced what others have. But are there hundreds of instances of illegal discrimination and cases based on interraciality that you cite in the book or that exist in the current times? I'm remembering in 1968 in Riverside, California, trying to rent an apartment, and I had it rented. When I presented myself, the landlord saw my wife through the window and withdrew it. Now that to me was discrimination against, well, in my mind, it was against her. It impacted me, but it was straight line race discrimination in housing.
Yes.
So when you send out testers, as I worked years ago, to test, you send out white people is what you do, to test the reaction in housing, jobs, and elsewhere. So are you finding a multitude of current cases that are based on interraciality, or are they cases where the discrimination against the person of color in the couple is what brings the grief?
Yes. So, great question. So, I think there are lots of cases that go unreported. So part of it, if I were to count it just simply by cases that people bring, you wouldn't have a whole lot of cases because there are very few of these interraciality cases to begin with. And I think for all the reasons why people would be deterred from bringing cases. And then also, then you also have a smaller population. But this is a common comment from the interracial couples that I interviewed in my book about discrimination. And in fact, I'm part of an interracial marriage, and my husband and I have had that exact experience numerous times ourselves. A good example, though, is what I would say is that you may find today, because people, and our society has changed such that it's not like considered PC or acceptable to dislike, for example, if you're white, to dislike black people. It may be okay. People may think it's fine if someone says, well, I don't approve of interracial dating, or I don't personally want to engage in any kind of interracial dating. And so I think what you're likely to find, and one of the things I talk about in my book, is these cases where you have someone who is fine renting, for example, to black people, monoracial black families, and they're fine renting to monoracial white families, but they're not okay with renting to people who are part of a multiracial family. And in that case, that would be very distinct, because that would be discrimination based upon race mixing and not upon the race of the person who is a minority in that relationship. And one of the things I talk about is the way that someone would have to currently plead a case, because the only way to recognize these claims is by saying, well, but for your race, this would be race discrimination, because but for the differences between your race and that of your partner, you wouldn't be being mistreated. that ends up sort of, if you're an interracial couple and you have to engage in that kind of pleading, you're really forced in a way in your pleadings to separate your family unit, while a monoracial family could really sort of just do a general pleading about how they were discriminated against as a family, as a couple. And that's not a real harm in the sense that I think any judge would actually recognize the claim, but there's kind of an expressive harm there in terms of being forced to plead one's claim in that kind of way, in a way that essentially forces one to break up their family. A good popular example of this exact kind of discrimination, where someone's like, oh, I'm okay with black people, I'm okay with white people, but I don't like interracial couples, is this judge in Louisiana who for years had been refusing to marry interracial couples. He says, I have black friends, I have white friends, I just don't think people should be mixing. And for years, his colleagues just took his referrals. An interracial couple would come to him, he would refuse to marry them, and they would take his referrals. Finally one couple decides to speak and his cover is blown. But for years, clearly those people who were his colleagues thought it was okay. They didn't report him for engaging in clearly illegal behavior, and they were judges. And so I think that you're more likely to find discrimination based on interraciality today than you still find traditional race discrimination, but you're also more likely to find discrimination based on interraciality today.
And this is more like an empirical question.
Sure.
And I just want to ask if there is a respectable way to refer to races.
Oh, is there a
First.
respectable way to refer to races?
Like African Americans, perhaps.
Well, I think different people have. I think though, if you have concern about it, I think that it's. If I were to advise someone, I would say it's probably safe to use Black or African American, and what anyone's particular preference is. It would just be an individual preference. So for me, I tend to like the term Black, but I like it because I think it's more inclusive. I think it includes immigrants, Black immigrants. It includes, I think it just includes. I think it would, to the extent that I just like it
Okay.
because I think it
So my
includes a more
question
global
is,
population.
like empirically, do you know, are there more white women marrying black men, or the other way around?
No, there's definitely twice as many black men out marry at twice the rate of black women. So you have significantly more couples who are black male, white female than you would have white male, black female couples. Did you have a question?
Hi, my name is Melanie. I'm a 1L at the law school here. And to kind of parse this idea about whether or not it's an issue of agency of people deciding to betray their race, or whether it's just an issue of disliking the fact of mixed race people, kind of. Did you find at all, going back to the discrimination in the workplace, that children of mixed race families, when their employers found out they were mixed race, if that was ever an issue in terms of discrimination or not being able to be promoted, or if it's just the actual act of saying, I'm going to marry this other person,
Right.
and being punished for that?
Yeah, I guess I actually never saw a case like that, but it wouldn't surprise me that would happen. But maybe it wouldn't. I mean, I think that, so for one of the things I would say is that it would depend on how that person insisted on identifying. So there's one professor who made a claim that said, well, one of the reasons we can accept Obama is because we're okay with horizontal interraciality. We're not okay with vertical. We're okay with vertical interraciality, but so we're okay if like Obama is biracial as long as he identifies as black. But if we're not okay with the fact that if Obama is going to marry a white woman, we don't like that. And so I could totally see that happening. And I wonder if part of the reaction to the individual would be based upon the fact on how they identified. Were they someone who was willing to sort of like put themselves in a clear-cut racial category and identify one way versus the other? But I never saw a case like that. Yeah. But it would be interesting to see if there was one, what the basis of that would be. Are they okay with someone who performs their identity in one way versus the other one, or identifies in one way versus the other?
During Obama's first time he ran, I would joke to myself that if people don't like him because he's black, they can like him because he's black, and vice versa. And so my oldest son has married a woman whose father is black, mother white. They have one child who's some of our black relatives said is a double whatever. However they sort of did it mathematically, that the child is there for, and the child of the child, it's almost like getting into quadroon, that kind of thinking, but not in a hateful way, but in a way that tries to figure out what is the identity that I would see from my own vantage point when I look at that person and I understand his or her background, and it's not figured out. And how they identify is up to them, but it either gets more complicated over time or it washes out.
Yes.
And I hope it's the latter.
Didn't the census, people had to change how they ask questions about identity to include multiple. races instead of just black, white. And
Right. So now you can check as many categories
Yeah.
as you'd like.
So in the back of the room, there is one table with lunch for you, and another table with books that you can purchase, and our speaker can sign. Please join me in thanking her.